Today we're going to be talking about the Polk R200 bookshelf speaker. Retail price is about $750 per pair, and I will just say overall up front, my impressions of this speaker are that it is a relatively neutral speaker. So overall, good tonality with some issues we're going to talk about. But the real issue for me is it is limited in output due to some mid-range distortions. This speaker is a two-way design. It features a 6.5-inch mid-woofer and a 1-inch ring radiator tweeter. And that ring radiator tweeter typically means that it's going to have a more narrow dispersion pattern in the higher frequencies, which means that you're going to want to aim this speaker on axis, meaning pointed directly at you. No toe out. Do not face this out into the room anywhere. Point the speaker more toward at you, and at most, go maybe 5 to 10 degrees out. Start with the pros. I would say that this speaker has reasonably tight focusing and imaging, meaning that the images within the soundstage are pretty easily pinpointed. Now, they're not super precise, and that's because this speaker features a reasonably wide but also somewhat narrow radiation pattern. The bass in room is good down to about 50 hertz, and honestly, I really just wanted more. Now, I've talked to people and I've read other reviews where they really like the bass, so maybe it's just me. But below about 60 hertz, there's just really not much there. For example, on Kodachrome by Paul Simon, there's a nice solid kick drum. It's thump, thump, thump. I love that. That's one of my favorite parts about that song, along with the cardboard box drumming going on. If you don't know what I'm talking about, make sure you Google that because it's really interesting. That thump is missing in these speakers, and that thump in other songs is missing in these speakers. So I would say that they get down to maybe 50 hertz in room, but really not much more below that. And there's really no authority to that mid bass or that kick drum thump. The R200 does have a really nice neutral mid-range, and I'm talking about mid-range. So about, let's say 200-300 hertz up to about 1 kilohertz. But around 1 kilohertz, there's a couple things that I noticed that we're going to talk about a little bit more in the data, but I'll just say up front that it would be considered what I call tinny or a slight of glare. In Steve Winwood's Higher Love, there is a triangle, I'm not really sure what it is, but there's a particular instrument that's played pretty much throughout the song. It's in the background, and I've not heard that triangle sound as tinny as it did with these particular speakers. So I went on the hunt with some equalization in my RTA using the microphone in my room, trying to figure out exactly where that was. I landed between somewhere around 800 hertz to 1 kilohertz. And then further listening, when I was listening to Sledgehammer by Peter Gabriel, his voice has a very distinct glare to it with these speakers. And it was kind of grating at times. So I started using the microphone again and trying to figure out where is that? You know, like to my ear, it sounded like it was in that 1 kilohertz area, but I wasn't sure. And then I looked at the data and I saw there's a resonance around 1 kilohertz. And I thought, well, maybe that's it. But I really just wasn't confident. To me, it sounded like maybe it was just a touch lower. And then I'm looking at the distortion data, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. And I saw that there is some, I would say, pretty significant distortion between 800 hertz to 1 kilohertz. And I thought that's got to be what it is. Now, I don't know exactly what frequencies that I was hearing that was bothering me, but I'm certain just based on what I was seeing in the RTA, what my ears were telling me, and then what I'm seeing in the data from the anechoic measurements, that it's probably in that 800 to 1 kilohertz area. So that's why I say that the mid-range, like the mid-range 200 to 1 kilohertz, give or take, is pretty neutral. But around that 1 kilohertz area, there's something that I didn't like. Above that, it's good again until you get to around 10 kilohertz. And the best way I can describe this, go with me, is if you've ever taken equalization and you've just tried to boost the highs on something, it sounds very artificial. And I hate to use the word digital, but it almost sounds like a digital-esque kind of sound to it. Well, these speakers somewhat have that above about 10 kilohertz. There's just an artificialness that really, truly reminded me of the sound that I get when I take EQ and I bump it up above 10 kilohertz. So that was another particular area I didn't really care for. But outside of those two areas, the speaker overall is pretty neutral. Now, with those subjective thoughts aside, let's look into the data and I'll explain some of what I see in the data and that also might explain some of what I was hearing when I was listening. The impedance data is what we're going to start off with first, and I really want to show this because I was surprised that this speaker is really close to a 4 ohm nominal speaker. Your AVR might drive it, especially if you use a crossover, which I would think that you would. You're going to use a subwoofer with a speaker most likely. So an AVR might drive it, but I don't think that I would really risk that. And if you do, just make sure you're careful with the volume. Otherwise, I would suggest a 4 ohm capable amplifier. I also wanted to note that there's a resonance around 300 hertz that shows up in this data. I did not hear this resonance, and I was kind of wondering, well, why didn't I hear that? If I heard these other things, why didn't I hear that? So I'm looking at the frequency response data, the on-axis response, and the listening window, which is just like a 30-degree average window, 10 degrees above and below, 30 degrees off to the side. And in that 300 hertz area, I see more of a dip. There's not really a peaking going on here. And I thought, well, maybe that's why I didn't hear it. So just kind of FYI there. On average, the sensitivity is about 86 decibels at 2.83 volts, 1 meter. And if we just kind of look at the trend line, we can see that the speaker is mostly within 1.5 dB up into about 10 kilohertz. Above 10 kilohertz, there is that peaking that I was talking about. That sounds somewhat artificial to me. Again, here's that 1 kilohertz resonance area. And I'm not sure what this is from. This could be some kind of enclosure resonance or maybe some kind of port resonance leaking. I'm not sure. But the bottom line is that I'm almost 100% certain I was hearing this or some artifact attributed to that. The F3 I said earlier is probably around 60 hertz. I was wrong. Look, it's actually 74 hertz. F10 is 50 hertz. So no wonder there was no bass thump from these speakers. So with this data, it's pretty obvious to tell that you're going to want a subwoofer with this speaker, especially if you want even just that thump out of the mid bass. I'm not even talking about trying to get into low frequency. You're still going to want a subwoofer with these speakers if you're going to get down to even maybe 40 hertz in the room. This is the spin data, and it kind of gives us an idea of, hey, all right, now I know the on-axis response, but what is the speaker doing overall, and how's its overall quality? And can I make EQ adjustments to make this speaker sound better in certain regards? The things that we mentioned a minute ago, the 10 kilohertz area and the 1 kilohertz area, they're obviously still there. This the same data, but there's additional data now. What we're going to look at down here is the early reflections directivity index, and the smoother this line is, the more likely we're going to be able to equalize the speaker. So this 1 kilohertz area, I was able to equalize that down. And when I did that, I was able to remove some of the tinniness that I heard in Steve Winwood's song with the triangle that I mentioned earlier. This 10 kilohertz and above area, I was also able to equalize that down some, but note that above around 16 kilohertz, this speaker's response falls off pretty quickly, and that also is due in part to the ring radiator tweeter. Here we have the estimated in-room response, which gives us an idea of the overall timbre or tonality of the speaker in room. It doesn't really give us any contextual clues as far as the stereo width, imaging, and things like that, but it gives us an idea of the overall timbre of the speaker. And we can see that this response is reasonably linear. We don't want flat in-room response. If you've watched my video about flat anechoic versus flat in-room, then you know what I mean. But if you haven't, click this link up here in the card. It'll be in the description below. Make sure you watch that video. This estimated in-room response is an idea of what the speaker is going to sound like in the room. So we don't want this to be flat. We want it to have some sort of slope to it. If I draw a trend line through here, you can see that yes, the speaker is still reasonably well maintained. But again, that 1 kilohertz resonance area is popping out. This is a representation of the stereo width done from taking on and off axis measurements using my Clipple near field scanner. And that gives us an idea of what the speaker's radiation pattern is like overall. And it gives us a really good idea of, you know, how wide might the soundstage sound when I had the speaker aimed on axis. And then you can also extrapolate that to off axis. So if you said you wanted to aim the speaker 10 degrees away from you, what's the radiation pattern relative to 10 degrees? You can still see that information here. So overall, I would say that the speaker's radiation pattern is at about plus or minus 60 degrees on average. But then above about 8 kilohertz, we can see there's a sharp increase in directivity. So the speaker's pretty wide until about 8 kilohertz, and then it just tightens up. And that's that ring radiator. That's a characteristic of ring radiator tweeters where they have narrow dispersion in the higher frequency. Almost ran out of breath. This is the vertical response. So going above the tweeter line and going below the tweeter line. I'm calling out two areas here. This is around the crossover region from the tweeter to the mid-range. We can see that the red has dissipated, which means that there's basically a hole in the response. And this really means that if we go above this 0 degree line, which is the tweeter plane, so if we go above or below the tweeter any more than just a few degrees, there's going to be a pretty significant timbre difference. So the sound is going to be different going above and below the tweeter, even by just a little bit. In other words, stay with your ears on the tweeter line. This is the distortion at 86 dB at 1 meter. Looks pretty reasonable to me. And this is the distortion at 96 dB at 1 meter. And again, it looks pretty reasonable to me. However, I'll note that around 6 kilohertz to 7 kilohertz, there's this peaking of second order distortion, which I find interesting. Maybe that was the artificial sound that I was hearing. I mean, I kind of doubt it, if I'm being honest. I feel like it's probably more the frequency response, but maybe. And then below about 50 hertz, we can see the distortion ramping up pretty significantly. Now, if I go and look at the multitone distortion. So what we looked at a minute ago was harmonic distortion. It's just a sweep. Multitone is like pink noise, and we're trying to emulate real music played through the speaker. Anything above this 3% line that I've got marked here in black is usually my indicator of poor performance. And we can see that at the higher output levels, which is roughly about 96 decibels at 1 meter, using this stimulus, there's higher distortion in this 6, 7, 800 to 1 kilohertz region. I mean, it's peaked up quite a bit, even to about 10% distortion, which is equivalent to 20 dB. Negative 20 dB is 10% distortion. So you're reaching around 10% distortion. Now, this is really what I think that I was hearing when I was hearing that glare. You know, I just, like with certain sounds, you know, at higher volumes, I just did not like it. Now, there are certain sounds at lower volumes in this same frequency area that I still didn't like. But I noticed that when I increased the volume, some of those sounds got worse. They're not all the same reasons. It's not the same reason that I didn't like 1 kilohertz versus 800 hertz. They're different things. So one is the frequency response has an anomaly around 1 kilohertz, which is a resonance. And then the distortion increases as you turn the volume up at a different frequency. So there's a couple bad things going on around the same area. One is distortion, and one is just poor linear response in the speaker. And so I just kind of highlighted that here for you to see that. Now let's talk about compression. How dynamic is the speaker's capability? That's what this test is for. It's 76 dB reference to, what is this, 86, 96, and 102 dB. And each line represents one of those output volumes. This is all at 1 meter. At 86 and 96 dB, so up to 20 dB of dynamic range, 76 to 86, and then 96, 20 dB. Dynamic range is pretty good. We can see on the lower frequencies, there's some sort of distortion effect going on. It's probably the woofer bottoming out, just not being able to take the excursion on the low frequencies. But then at 102 dB, so at 26 dB of dynamic range, you can see that there's more compression going on here with this particular speaker, and there's more issue with that woofer. It really is doing some funky stuff. So using a crossover will fix this, and a crossover like 80 hertz or even 100 hertz is going to solve some of this for sure, and you won't really have to worry about the woofers bottoming out. But a crossover won't completely get rid of the compression overall. So earlier I said that I think the speaker is good for the most part, but you've really got to keep the volume in mind. This combined with the distortion that I talked about a second ago, those are the reasons why you have to keep the volume in check and just listen to them at sane levels. Otherwise, you're going to run into some of the audible issues that I had. That does it for this review. I appreciate you watching, and I hope you learned something. If you have any questions, please ask in the comment section below. If you like this video and or you're not subscribed, please go through the typical things of thumbing up, hit the subscribe button, and hitting the notification bell. If you're interested in buying these speakers, please consider using one of my generic affiliate links below. So I've got generic affiliate links to Amazon, Audio Advice, Crutchfield, and some others. They're not direct links to this particular speaker. You have to go and type in what it is that you want. And I do that so people don't say that I'm shilling products. So if you are wanting to buy the speaker, you're going to have to do a little bit of extra work to do my affiliate link part. But that would be certainly appreciated by me, because that does help me earn a small commission at no additional cost to you. You can still use those generic affiliate links for anything else. So if you want to buy a different speaker other than this, please, again, consider using one of my generic affiliate links. I will talk to y'all later. I hope you have a good day. Take care. Peace.